Good morning, everybody. I have to start by thanking Casa Árabe and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for organizing this seminar and for inviting me. I was asked to talk about the new ways of participation, political participation. Wait, it's in Spanish. Okay. So I will focus on Tunisia. I am a Tunisian citizen. When I was asked to talk about these new ways of participation, I started talking with people around me in civil society to get their opinion about this. And I collected these ideas and tried to divide them into categories. So the first one is about what I would call old ways of participation. I mean by that ways that were already existing in Tunisia and already existing, of course, in other democratic countries for decades and centuries, but in Tunisia existing in a biased way. These ways, I will develop more later, were rediscovered with the revolution of 2011, developed, expanded, and democratized. Then I will talk about new ways of political participation that are discovered somehow in Tunisia. I will, of course, talk a little bit about social networks, but there are other ways to participate in the political scene in Tunisia, and they are characterized by creativity and reactivity. So the old ways are three: political parties, unions, and civil society organizations. The first one, political parties. Why am I talking about rediscovery of political parties? Of course, because we had ones before the revolution. If I can be more precise, we had 7 parties before 2011. One of them was the Democratic Constitutional Rally, the party of Ben Ali, التجمع الدستوري الديمقراطي. And 4 of the 6 other parties were somehow directly or indirectly related to the Tajamma. After the revolution in 2011, we had this exponential growth of political parties. I can give you some examples. We moved from 7 parties before 2011 to 117 parties for the elections of the National Constituent Assembly. It makes more than 11,000 candidates representing 1,400 lists in 2011, and it's somehow the same figures for 2014 legislative elections. 55 parties, more than 50,000 candidates, and 1,500 lists. This exponential growth we can discuss that if you want, positive and negative impacts. I will just talk about the positive one right now, which is that any Tunisian citizen could find a political party to represent him in the election, from the extreme left to the extreme right. Then the second old way after political parties are labor unions. Again, in Tunisia, before 2011, we had labor unions. If I can be more precise, we had one labor union, الاتحاد التونسي للشغل, the General Union of Tunisian Workers. It was the unique labor union in Tunisia, and after 2011, in a period of 9 or 10 months, we had more than 25 labor unions created, each per sector, and I give you here the most important ones. Yes. So these labor unions played a very important role, of course, in their respective sector, but they also played a very important role in mediation, political mediation. You've probably heard of the crisis Tunisia went through in 2013 after assassination of a member of the parliament of the National Constituent Assembly, Mohamed Brahmi, Allah yarahmu, and labor union such as UTK and Ittihad Tunsi al-Shoghl played this role of mediation between political parties to find a solution to the crisis. They played this role in coordination with another example of old ways of participation, which are civil society organizations. I'm not going to develop a lot about this. You are probably all aware of how civil society looks like in Tunisia. I will just give some figures again. We used to have before 2011 more than 9,000 organizations in Tunisia. The specific thing is that between 85 and 90% of the civil society organizations in Tunisia were dedicated to only three sectors, which were environment, sports, and cultures. So you can understand that we were very far from anything related to politics. After the revolution of 2011 and until now, a recent report of the UNDP in 2015 is stating that we have in Tunisia 18,000 organizations, and that 90% of the organizations founded since 2011 are dedicated to sectors such as democracy, human rights, and citizenship. So we are closer to politics with the civil society. I would give you here some examples. You have in the middle iWatch, with a Tunisian organization working on transparency. You have Muraqibun, with an organization working on election monitoring and election observation. You have Al-Bawsala, I'm a member of this organization, as well as Jeunes Démocrates Indépendants. Al-Bawsala is working on transparency with state institutions such as the parliament, the Ministry of Finance, or decentralized authorities, municipalities, and regional councils. I would then go to the new ways of participation after the labor unions, political parties, and civil society organization. As I told you, the characteristic of these old ways is the exponential growth, the number after the revolution. The new ways, I tried to give you a list of these new ways. The first one is about social networks. The first point is about social networks and media. I'm not going to go too much into details with that point. I think that the next sessions are going to tackle the most important things. Plus, I think that most of you know how social networks and social media are working. It's mostly about Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn for certain people, YouTube, and people until now are using them, at least in the civil society, Tunisian civil society, as professional tools to organize meetings, to organize events, to organize protests, and to even somehow organize the associations from inside. The second point is about artistic contestation. Many of my friends asked me to talk about this point. It's very important. I'm talking about exhibitions, movies, TV series, street art, dance. I would just give you some examples of artistic contestation we had in Tunisia. This is one example. In June 2012, we had this exhibition at Al Abdeliya Palace in suburbs of Tunis, and Mohammed Ben Slema, who is the artist, gave an exhibition about the place of religion in the Tunisian society and the place of religion in politics. And this exhibition, and this is one of the paintings that he presented during the exhibition, led to massive protests, especially from Salafists and Islamists. because of the representation of religion and because of a representation of women during the exhibition. The Abdelaya Palace, which is a historical building, was burnt down after the protests, and renovations took place in 2014. Now the palace opened its gates 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago. A second example is not about a Tunisian movie, but about a French movie called Persepolis by an Iranian movie maker, and the movie was broadcasted on a private channel, Nesma TV, in October 2012, and again led to massive protests. People were, I think that we had more than 100 people injured and a policeman dead because of the protests. Again, it's Islamists or Salafists who were protesting all over the country. What I wanted to tell you with this new way of participation is that artistic contestation or arts in general are a way to convey ideas through exhibitions or movies or street art, and it has a concrete and undeniable impact on public opinion in Tunisia, and these protests can show you how people are getting or understanding art in its different forms. Then I will talk about another point, which is engaging legal pursuits. In Tunisia, after the revolution, we had this, again, exponential growth of people suing, whether it is state authorities, centralized or decentralized authorities, political parties, organizations, labor unions. People saw courts or tribunals as a way to impose their rights or their will. I can give you an example from the organization I'm a part of, Al-Bawsala, who which in 2013 sued more than 20 municipalities, decentralized authorities, for not making their budgets and accountability public on their websites or in situ. Then I would say that courts and law firms in Tunisia have never been so much sought in such a period of time. I can give you some examples of law firms who were created after the revolution just to deal with these cases of people suing state to impose their rights. It's their specialty. The next point is about calling for legal reforms. Many individual law professors or civil society organizations, whether national or international organizations, were asking since 2011 for major legal reforms with the National Constituent Assembly and now with People Representatives Assembly. And these reforms were related to different things, such as human rights, such as now we have in Tunisia the bill on freedom of access to information in discussion at the parliament. It was, of course, related also to the constitution making process in 2014, 2013, and 2014. I can give you examples of organizations such as Muraqibun, I mentioned earlier, but also Shabab Bila Hudud, which participated to the adoption of the election law for the 2014 legislative and presidential elections. Actually, they gave to the parliament the first draft of the law, and the members of the parliament used it as a basis to adopt the final legislation. The next point is about quotas and representativity. It's a way to encourage people to participate to a decision-making process. It's specifically focusing on two social categories, which are women and youth. I can give you an example in the newly adopted constitution for women, Article 34, Article 46, imposing a quota, a parity, men-women in all elected assemblies of the countries. We had that for the parliament, even if the result at the end is not 50-50, but political parties or lists for running for the election, legislative election, had to implement a rule of horizontal parity, men-women or women-men with alternates. And for youth, we have an article, a whole article in the Constitution, basically saying nothing, but we have it at least about the power of youth in the country and the necessity of involving or getting youth involved into the decision-making processes. We have also quotas in the elections, legislative elections. Parties are obliged to integrate at least one candidate, male or female, under 35 years old in the 4 first places or 4 first ranks in each list running for the legislative seat. And there's another article for local elections talking about representation of youth in the lists running for the election. The last new way of participation, political participation after the revolution, is what I try to call the free campaigns with the hashtag Twitter hashtag before the free. I give you here some examples of how we used these new ways of participation. Actually, it's the hashtag Twitter is a way to refer to somebody, generally the free. You have the hashtag free and then the name of someone. In the upper right side of the PowerPoint, you can see free Aziz. Aziz Amemi is a very famous blogger, a very famous activist, human rights activist in Tunisia. And in 2012, he was arrested and detained for drugs consumption, zatla, basically cannabis. And you can easily understand that it was not the only reason for his arrest. And it's a huge campaign started with this hashtag, and it was on social media, of course, but it was also during protests, field protests. It was in articles written in media and other ways, and we kind of collect all these tools or ways of participation through this hashtag. And you have another example here with Kafon. Kafon is a singer, rap singer in Tunisia, and he was also arrested and detained for drugs consumption. It's very common in Tunisia. And he spent 2 months, Aziz Amemi also, they both spent a quarter of the period of time they were condemned for. 2 months for Kafon, 6 months for Aziz Amemi, while they were condemned for 5 and respectively 3 and 5 years of prison. So there's somehow an impact. I don't say that the free campaigns are the only reason for why they have been released, but it somehow contributed. And then you have a last one here, Nader and Sofiane. I have to talk about them. Nader and Sofiane are Tunisian journalists detained by the Islamic State in Libya. They were doing a documentary there. They are detained there since June 2014. And we had in Tunisia a very big movement to call for their release, or at least to ask Tunisian authorities to give information about them. Islamic State released information 2 or 3 weeks ago about their supposed killing or murdering, but the Tunisian state is not, until this moment, able to confirm or deny the information. In order to avoid giving you an idealistic image of the new ways of, and all ways of participation in Tunisia, I would just mention negative points. If you're interested, we can discuss that with much more details during the debate. I would talk first about the effectiveness. of these new ways of participation, I forgot to add an interrogation mark of the effectiveness. People are doubting of the usefulness of these new ways of participation. Then I will talk about the double standards with the new ways, especially with the free campaigns. It would simply mean that if you are a human rights activist, if you are famous somehow, you are very lucky, and you will be very lucky to have free campaigns. You will have shields from civil societies with you and helping you to get out from prison or not being arrested or things like that. But if you're a common citizen in Tunisia now, today, if you're a citizen lambda, as we call, you have many chances to be unlucky and to find no one helping you. The third thing is about the lack of cohesion, the exponential growth of political parties, of civil society organizations, of labor unions led, in my opinion, to this lack of cohesion. It means that I can give you a very simple example. In the 2014 legislative election, more than 1 million votes, so people's choices, were not represented at the parliament. This lack of cohesion led to this dispersion of ideas, of opinions. People, it looks like individual activities. I can name political parties or civil society organization made by one guy or one woman. He or she is the unique member of the political party or of the civil society organization. Then the next point is about the civil society versus political parties. We have, again, in my opinion, today in Tunisia, a very strong civil society with very strong organizations, with very competent people, highly qualified in many fields. But in front of that, we have very weak political parties. They are unable to build very real and strong political programs, and they are unable to absorb these qualified people from the civil society organizations. And the last point is about participation and regional disparity. Now, generally in the inner parties of the country, people are still using the old ways, rediscovering the old ways I talked about earlier, which are political parties and civil society organizations. There are very few civil society organizations from the southern and western parts of Tunisia who are using social media as a tool, as a professional tool. It's much more, and even artistic contestation are much more a thing in Tunis, in the capital city, and in the coastal areas of the country. I would be glad to discuss these points with you if you're interested. Thank you for listening to me and for your attention.
Thank you, Zied, for this overview. Forgot to very quickly introduce Zied, but as you've heard, he's a member of Al-Bawsala, who's a Tunisian NGO involved in monitoring and state institutions and transparency. He is also involved in the NGO called Young Independent Democrats, acting towards the promotion of human rights and citizen principles and raising political awareness in Tunisia. Also follows international affairs, especially those related to the Arab world and Africa. Zied has a bachelor degree in public law from Carthage University and a master's degree from Aix-en-Provence in international law with a focus on post-conflict state building and transitional justice. So we'll very quickly move from this specific case of Tunisia, which, as some of you know, has had a much better transition than Egypt. Egypt has been a roller coaster ride. It had 7 elections and referendums, but none of its high officials today has been elected to pretty much anything. It also, you know, the outcomes are very different. The role of the army, which in Tunisia has stayed above the fray. In Egypt, it has intervened repeatedly. The way the religious parties. Also in Tunisia, Ennahda was very cautious, and it was also much more disciplined. The role of the labor union in Tunisia was also, I think, essential, as Ziad pointed as well. It's relatively independent, and it could act as a mediator, whereas in a country like Egypt, labor unions are neither independent nor powerful. And also important, I think, that the secularists in Tunisia did not demand a ban on the Ennahda religious government. But we also know for certain that there's many Tunisian foreign fighters that have decided to join the battle in Iraq and Syria. So there's something that is not exactly fine there. For the specific issue of religious movements and politics, we have invited Nader Hashemi, or Nader for its American pronunciation. And Nader is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies and an associate professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He obtained his doctorate from the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and previously was an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern University and a visiting assistant professor at the UCLA Global Institute. He's the author of Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy Toward a Democratic Theory for Muslim Societies, and co-editor of The People Reloaded, The Green Movement and the Struggle for Iran's Future, and also of The Syria Dilemma. So, Nader, your turn, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Karim, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I want to speak about religious movements in the Arab Spring and post-Arab Spring environment. I also want to say something about the future of democracy in the Arab Islamic world. Now, on Friday mornings 4 years ago, the pictures on Arab television screens developed a curious habit of multiplying. It would split into 2, then 3, then more look-alike frames. At the end of noon prayers, as mosques emptied in sequence across 4 time zones, news teams in city after city beamed up dramatic imagery that was strikingly similar. The same vast, joyous, flag-waving crowds surged into the Pearl Roundabout in Manama, the capital of Bahrain, thronged the Tahrir squares of Sana'a, the Yemenis capital, and Egypt's great metropolis of Cairo, and swarmed the beachfront in Benghazi, Libya, and the jasmine-lined avenues in Tunis. Everyone was chanting the same slogan, Ash-Shab yurid isqat an-nizam, the people demand the fall of the regime. There were many such days in the winter and spring of 2011, as if a hidden conductor had orchestrated a pan-Arab symphony of protest, and these uprisings did bring about momentous change. Before the Arab Spring began to stir in December 2010, the world's 350 million Arabs seemed oddly immune to the democracy bug that had infected most of the corners of the globe. Whether republics or monarchies, nearly all of the 22 Arabic-speaking countries had solidified into similar political forms. Their varied constitutional systems were flimsy disguises for strongman rule. The people, including millions of jobless young people, had no say in how their societies were run. And so if you were to look at a map of the world and you were to sort of block out those countries that were undemocratic, they tended to overlap with the Arab world. Roughly 4 years ago, however, in breathtakingly short order, the decades-old dictatorships in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen collapsed. As popular pressure mounted, the Arab governments announced political reforms, more public spending, and other concessions to appease their restless populations. A region-wide burst of youthful energy that reminded Westerners of their own liberating social upheavals in the 1960s suggested a new sense of empowerment and hope. The, quote, Arab or Islamic exception the argument that somehow these neo-patriarchal states could move in conjunction with international standards of governance, that long-held view seemed to have been overcome by the Arab Spring. Now, sadly, those deeply intoxicating and hopeful days have now long passed. The mood across the Arab Islamic world now is one of doom and of gloom. Darkness pervades the political landscape, and for the foreseeable future, the broader Middle East is headed for a period of deep instability and turbulence. What does this mean for the question of religious movements in the Arab Islamic world? What lessons have they learned from the past 4 years, and what role do they pretend to play in the coming years? I think the question of religious movements in the Arab world and the future of democracy, particularly in the context of the Arab Spring, has been marked by 2 seminal and key events. Number 1, the July 2013 military coup in Egypt, and number 2, the rise and expansion of ISIS. Now, the coup in Egypt can be situated and should be situated in the context of the counter-revolution project that was launched by old entrenched elites, the deep states, the old authoritarian regimes, backed significantly by Saudi, Emirati money, and with the acquiescence of most of the Western world, who stood on the side and watched the counter-revolution slowly take shape. I think Bahrain was a sign of things to come when in the spring of 2011, Saudi tanks rolled into Bahrain to crush the prospects for political change there. Bashar al-Assad's quasi-genocidal assault on the Syrian people reveals the extreme distance that some ruling elites are willing to go in order to retain and preserve political power. Rumor has it now that 15% of the United Arab Emirates' GDP is devoted to promoting the counter-revolution and the de-democratization of the Middle East. This attempt to roll back the democratic gains achieved during the Arab Spring is now also backed by a vast set of political networks that comprise various right-wing American Republican groups, right-wing European political parties, and also Israeli Likudniks and their supporters, who share the basic same view as the Arab dictators. And the evidence of this is abundant, but you can see it in the language and the description of religious groups. All of these counter-revolutionary forces tend to purposely and decidedly blur the distinctions between all Islamist groups. So we're told, for example, that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt equals ISIS equals Boko Haram. What does this state of affairs mean for the future of political Islamists, particularly the mainstream political Islamist groups, the moderate ones that were committed to electoral politics and to a strategy of nonviolence? Now, context is everything when it comes to discussing political Islam, and no 2 Islamist movements are alike, because fundamentally they are shaped by their local environments. What works in Egypt won't work in Tunisia. What works in Turkey won't work in Saudi Arabia. Anyone familiar with the diversity of the Muslim world, its socioeconomic characteristics, cultures, political systems, and trajectories of intellectual development is bound to realize that the political manifestation of Islam, like the practice of Islam itself, are to a great extent context-specific, the results of the interpretation of religious precepts and local culture, including many different political cultures. Now, the political context in the Arab world today, as I just described, is an environment that is broadly characterized by the rise of neo-fascistic forces. It's a political context that is extremely bloody and brutal, and the Muslim Brotherhood is facing an attempt to eradicate it from the political scene by General el-Sisi, backed by Saudi and Emirati petrodollars. The massacres in Egypt in the summer of 2013 in places such as Rabaa al-Adawiya and other locations have been described by Human Rights Watch as, quote, probably crimes against humanity, quote, the worst mass unlawful killings in the history of Egypt, and they have been compared to the Chinese massacre of peaceful protesters in Tiananmen Square in 1989. In short, we are witnessing an extremely brutal, violent, and comprehensively sort of draconian political context. And this has deeply affected the internal debates and the orientations of moderate mainstream Islamist groups and their sympathizers across the Arab world. So as a result of the de-democratization of the Arab Spring and the Arab world, we are seeing the opening up of old debates that had largely been resolved and that had largely been won by more peaceful, moderate expressions of political Islam. Old debates such as the question of whether it was useful to participate in the formal politics of a country. Debates such as whether the use of nonviolence was a good strategy to initiate political change. The old debate about the nature of a future sort of democratic state, a civil state that had influence of some religious norms versus a more draconian, hardline Islamic state. All of these questions now have been reopened and are being re-examined, and unfortunately, the forces that offer a more radical interpretation of those debates, they had largely been marginalized or silenced, but as a result of the crackdown and the brutality and the ending of the Arab Spring, those voices are now increasingly popular. Now, the crushing of the Arab Spring can also be linked to the rise of ISIS as an alternative ideological option that has attracted the imagination of some young people in the Arab world when peaceful options for political change no longer exist. ISIS is attracting attention in part because it is winning. It holds a large piece of territory in the heart of the Arab world. It seems to be difficult to dislodge them. Even if you look at the best case scenario and you're able to dislodge ISIS out of Iraq, they are deeply entrenched in Syria and they won't be going anywhere anytime soon. Now, for some young people in the region, ISIS, unfortunately, serves as a possible ideological option, largely because there are no alternative peaceful options available. In the case of ISIS, they seem to be, at least at first glance, politically successful. They're pursuing political change and transformation, yes, of a very radical and brutal sort, but at least it's political change. While the rest of the Arab world, the doors for political change have been closed shut very violently. It's also important to realize with the attempt to eradicate the Muslim Brotherhood and other mainstream electorally committed Islamist groups, this has had a very negative effect in terms of allowing for more radical expressions of political Islamic identity to emerge and then to gravitate in an extremist direction. One of the successful roles that groups like the Muslim Brotherhood did play in Egypt and in other Arab societies is they acted as a buffer, as a restraint. If you had a particular Islamic identity, if you're interested in political change, you could join the Muslim Brotherhood, you could try and participate in electoral politics, and that was an avenue where basically potentially radicalized Islamist or religious opinion could be contained within the formal politics of the state. With the removal of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, that buffer, that constraint is no longer there, and a stark choice is left between people who have an Islamic or a religious identity. Either you become silent, you shut up, you do nothing, or you start to entertain more radical options, more extremist options, such as the one that ISIS represents. Unfortunately, there is no other third option, and this does not bode well for the future of the Arab Islamic world. My broader point here is that there is a deep and intimate link in the Arab world between democratization and violence. And the relationship is one of inverse proportion. The more that the doors of democracy, the more that the opportunities for political change open, the less the likelihood of political violence. And we can see this clearly in the case of Syria, for example. In the early days of the Syrian revolution, most of the demonstrations were largely peaceful, largely non-sectarian. In 2011, there was no Jabhat al-Nusra. There was no ISIS, there was no Al-Qaeda. There were simply peaceful protesters confronting a dictatorial regime. As the repression mounted, as the violence increased, as the doors and the hope for political change diminished, you saw in directly proportion to the closing of those doors of peaceful political change an upsurge in radical Islamist sentiment and opportunities, of course backed and fueled by some of the regional countries. There's an excellent study, in fact, that looked at the jihadi discourses in the context of the Arab Spring that was published in the United States in 2013. And this study actually chronicled and noted how the ideological appeal of al-Qaeda during the Arab Spring was reduced to an all-time very low level. Their message was incoherent. They had very few followers because it seemed like peaceful political change and political opportunities were there in the Arab world that could bring about meaningful transformations without resorting to violence. That has all changed, and now we're seeing a predictable upsurge in violent narratives and violent sort of organization. We don't have good statistics on this, but I suspect very soon we'll start to see figures where large numbers of young Egyptians are now moving to Iraq and Syria to join ISIS as a direct result of the brutal crackdown happening within their own countries. Now, reflecting on the Arab Spring as it unfolded 4 years ago, one prominent Middle East scholar noted that the year 2011 is to the Arabs what 1989 was to the communist world. The Arabs are now coming into ownership of their own history, this scholar noted, and we have to celebrate this fact. This observation is correct in terms of the historical and moral significance of the Arab uprisings for the people of the region. But the comparison with Eastern Europe after the Cold War, I think, is very misleading. The problem with this analogy is that it establishes a false expectation for measuring political development. It suggests that Europe is somehow the gold standard, with the implication being that transitions to democracy in the Arab world should be smooth, peaceful, and would be uneventful. And if they are not, then something perhaps must be fundamentally wrong with the character of the Arab Islamic world. Now, the obvious needs to be stated. The Middle East, or the broader Arab Islamic world, is not Eastern Europe. The historical experiences of these two regions have been vastly different, both in terms of their pre-modern and modern eras. The indices that social scientists typically use to measure the prospects for stable democratic transitions and consolidations revolve around a certain level of socio-economic modernization, for example, higher levels of industrialization, literacy, mass communication, the presence of a sizable and an appropriate class structure. In other words, is there a sizable middle class? And the presence of a suitable political culture. In other words, are there democracy-enhancing cultural norms, habits, and values in place? The more that these factors are in play, the greater the prospects for democracy. A simple comparison between Eastern Europe in the 1990s and the Arab world today reveals that the social conditions that provided for relatively smooth transitions to democracy in Eastern Europe do not exist in the case of the Arab Islamic world. Stormy waters and different pathways lie ahead for the Middle East. We need a new analytical framework where the long view of history is our best guide. Looking forward, a comparative study of the modernization processes across the Islam-West divide is instructive in terms of understanding the future trajectory of the Arab Spring. In this context, Princeton historian L. Carl Brown has observed that the very vertiginous convulsions and social upheavals that accompany the process of modernization, when traditional societies are transformed and reshaped by modern socioeconomic and political forces, seems to be more pronounced and qualitatively different in the case of Arab Islamic societies than in comparison with the West. Underlying the changes for Reformation Europe were increased literacy, the rise of printing, the early stirring of exploration and entrepreneurship that would lead to capitalism. A case can be made, however, that in the Muslim world today, that this part of the world is seized with the equivalent of all such flat factors plus more. Not only are there increases in literacy, publications, rural to urban migration, and economic interdependence greater for today's Muslims than for Europe during the Reformation period, but the time involved is squeezed down for today's Arab and Muslims to a few decades, as opposed to at least a century and a half, if not more, for Reformation Europe. While Professor Brown was referring to the general process of modernization and its associated effects, the Arab Islamic world is simultaneously experiencing, within a relatively short historical span of time, three simultaneous destabilizing processes. Number one, the struggle for democracy or democratization, the struggle to transfer power from old ruling elites to people and their representatives. This is inherently a disruptive process, as we have seen in the Arab Spring. The old guard of the ancien regime is still very much present and serves as a complicating factor in these democratic transitions. Removing a dictator is one thing, overhauling a corrupt political system and a deep state replete with nepotism, cronyism, patron clientelism is a far greater challenge. It will take years before new rules of the political game are established and before all the key players and stakeholders accept that popular sovereignty and not elite sovereignty is the only game in town. The second destabilizing process facing the Arab Islamic world today is what I call the struggle for political secularization. By this I mean the difficult process of democratically negotiating the normative role of religion in politics. This process is always conflict-ridden, first because religion is an emotionally charged subject connected to people's personal and group identity, but also because different political constituencies have vastly different ideas on the proper role that religion should play in political life. Generating a democratic consensus on this topic will take time and will inevitably produce conflict and tension, as we've already seen in the constitutional debates that have taken place in Tunisia and in Egypt. And finally, the Arab world is also being stabilized by a third process, the process of globalization. Social scientists have long recognized a deep connection in the late 20th century between the rise of particularist ideas and doctrines and groups and the increasing globality of our planet. Based on fundamental changes in technology, from the media age to the information age, globalization has greatly heightened awareness among previously segmented and isolated populations. The concept of identity is, after all, relational, in that individuals and groups define themselves in relation to other groups and individuals in society. The more that we are aware of the plurality of groups and societies in our world, the more this forces the question, what is distinct and unique about my community in a globalized world? Benjamin Barber, in a widely read book over 20 years ago called Jihad versus McWorld, argued this precise point, noting that the rise of ethno-religious nationalism at the end of the 20th century was directly in proportion and was a reaction to the increasing political, economic, and cultural interdependence of our planet. In other words, globalization is a byproduct and produces a reaction where people search for particularist identities and search for a new identity in a globalized world. Post-Arab Spring societies are deeply affected by this global phenomenon, and it is a complicating process that makes the struggle for democracy that much more difficult. On the plus side, however, the Arab Spring has also opened up new opportunities that were previously inconceivable. 4 years ago today, the very thought of a post-Mubarak Egypt or a post-Gaddafi Libya or a post-Ben Ali Tunisia was unimaginable. Today, these are realities. Yes, the military is back in power in Egypt, but important lessons have been learned. The demise of long-standing dictators has shaken the foundations of authoritarianism in the Arab Islamic world. The ripple effects of these developments will resonate far and wide. The key point that I'm trying to convey to you this morning is that the Arab Spring is not a single event, but rather a long-term process of political change. We need to view this subject not in terms of days or months, but in terms of years and decades. In retrospect, the term Arab Spring was deeply misleading. It strongly suggested that transitions to democracy in the Arab world would take place in one season. This by itself led to unrealistic expectations and then quick disappointment when the results that we were all hoping for didn't materialize. For example, many people in the West thought that after 4 decades of Muammar al-Gaddafi's totalitarian rule, that Libya could be transformed into Sweden in a few months. The broader point here is that decades of political authoritarianism leave behind a legacy, and it will take time to develop a new political culture, new rules for politics, new patterns for cooperation, tolerance, and new willingness for political actors to compromise. In conclusion, let me make a feeble attempt to balance my pessimistic scenario with perhaps a final hopeful message. The mold of regime authoritarianism and popular impotence has been broken by events in the Arab Spring. However problematic the outcomes that we are all witnessing in various countries, a new generation of political activists, aided by modern social media, has come of age. Their politics are deeply refreshing in its universalist concerns with liberty and social justice. Let us hope that over time, this generation will succeed in building up new constituencies, associations, and institutions that can form the basis of a future democratic part of the Arab Islamic world. Thank you.
Thank you, Nader, for that positive note towards the end. We'll move swiftly on to Fátima El-Issawi. Speaking of old habits die hard, I think this will probably be part of Fatima's tackling the fourth and definite power, media. Fatima is a senior lecturer at the University of Essex and research fellow at the London School of Economics Middle East Center, currently leading on a project entitled Arab National Media and Politics, Democracy Revisited, which looks at changes in media practices in traditional media industries in Morocco and Algeria. This project builds on previous research looking at the transformations brought by the transitional political landscape to Arab traditional media in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. The in-depth field data was instrumental in mapping trends in traditional media under transitions, providing sustained and updated data on the intricate link between media and democratization in Arab countries under transition. Fatima has over 15 years of experience in covering the Middle East for international media such as Agence France Presse and the BBC Arabic service, with a specific expertise in Iraq and Lebanon. She's also a media consultant for several media development and international agencies. So we'll give Fatima the floor, then we'll get a couple of questions from you, and then we'll move on to the coffee break, where you'll be able also to interact with our speakers in order to keep to our schedule, more or less. Fatima. Oh, yes.
You need to play it somewhere? Okay, I'll play it like this. Okay. Okay. Well, first, thank you for inviting me to be with you here today in Madrid to talk about my research project. It started before 3 years with a simple idea. What is going on in traditional national Arab media? So the idea with us for us was with the excessive focus on social media and politics under transition and after the uprisings. Our idea was to try to understand what's going on with traditional, and I mean here by TV, radio, and print institutional media after the uprising, whether this media sector that used to be heavily censored under former regime is witnessing any internal democratization in how journalists deal with their daily practices and values and perception of their roles, and how they are coping with this shaky and unpredictable transition, and whether they are impacting the democratization process negatively or positively or in any other way. This idea, which was first supported by a grant from Open Society, and now it's supported by the Middle East Center, funded and supported by the center itself, took me in a very exciting journey, meeting, doing extensive field research in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, and meeting with journalists from this sector that was not really the focus of research and media after the uprising. And today I want to share with you some of the highlights of this meeting with journalists, and which reflects three sets of main problems. First, regulatory and structural, second, institutional, and third, editorial. So after the first chapters of the Arab uprisings, traditional national media gained to a certain extent a pluralistic tone and witnessed an immense and chaotic expansion. However, challenges were still tremendous and are today huge, mainly the heavy legacy of former regimes, state control over media, oppressive and outdated regulatory and structural system, but also perceptions among journalists of the role of being defenders of political agendas and lately defenders of regime, and blurred lines between the role of activism and advocacy and media reporting and journalism. Well, although new constitutions guarantee important rights and were really avant-gardist on paper, the reality is that little progress has been achieved. Prison sentences are still applied for defamatory speeches. Journalists in many places, especially in Egypt, still face trials and even before military courts. Egypt is, we have here one of cases of journalists imprisoned in Egypt. Mohammed Abu Zaid was imprisoned just for doing his job, reporting on protests. He's now in prison for more than 500 days, but he's one of many arrested, making Egypt a leading country in jailing journalists, with no less than 60 journalists in prison for different reasons, most of them arbitrarily detained without even no trial at all or no accusation at all. We are witnessing a variety of tools of intimidation and repression against journalists, moving from redundant and repressive legal provisions that in most of the case are still applied after the revolutions, to arbitrary measures taken under the name of combating terrorism and the safeguard of national security, with again Egypt as a main example, but also the special political and security conditions and the violence where oppression by the regime is replaced by oppression by militias and armed groups, and the situation in Libya is an excellent example in this way. Ahmed Sghayar, he's one of journalists I met in Libya. Journalists, most of them, when I met with a large number of them in Libya, they were so excited immediately after the uprising that change will happen. At least they start doing their job of reporting from the field, and they can reflect a diversity of views. I was really, I had an amazing feeling of how Libyan journalists were excited by this opportunity. Unfortunately, with violence ripening now in the country divided into two regions, governed whether by the army, the national army, or militias, the margin of dissenting voices, diversity in media is very minimal, and media is again used as a mouthpiece, whether for armed group or for the national, the so-called national army. Well, a major topic in media reform after the uprising was what to do with the state media, the state-funded media, what to do with this redundant and old-fashioned media sector. A simple example, in the state broadcaster in Egypt, we have more than 43,000 employees. Most of them are not journalists. They were appointed because having good connections with the regime. The problem of reforming this old-fashioned sector is very complex, and most of the reform were not successful, with the exception of the Tunisian example, where progress is achieved and noticeable on different levels. But the most problematic facet of this huge problem is the perception of journalists themselves, that this sector is mainly conceived to serve as a platform to assert the authority of the regime and to embellish its face. And in most of the case, these journalists cannot identify with a different role than defending and serving the regime. After the uprising, state newsrooms witnessed a kind of shock which couldn't amount to a revolution, and I can call it a kind of awakening, where state journalists started talking about working differently, and for them, the most common slogan among them was a media that represents the people, although they couldn't have a practical translation of how state media can serve the people. But in most of the case, where journalists were not able to assume editorial independence, they couldn't work without directives. They needed these directives to be oriented on their work. And I like very much this example coming from Amira Arfawi. I met her in my first visit to Tunisia immediately, directly after the uprising. And Amira talked to me about how confused she is. Not only she, but also most of journalists working with her in state TV. And I like very much how she framed her situation. And she said to me, we used to be the trumpet of the regime. We did not have the choice. And now we're fearing the people. And also, again, we are a trumpet of the people. And we are so scared of publishing any news or doing any reports from the field that can anger the so-called people. And when I asked her, so who are these people? How you can understand these people? Then she said, we don't know. This is what we hear coming from other media, from private media, but we don't understand who are these people. So working without directives was and still, and I'll talk more in the coming slides, a huge problem for state media. Also, after the uprising, we witnessed a strong appetite to invest in private media, and the wave of expansion of private media was accompanied by a lack of modern and comprehensive regulatory structure. After the uprising, we witnessed an unprecedented expansion of plurality of views and opinion on media platforms, mainly on private media, but also state media. Unfortunately, this trend regressed with the excessive political polarization under, in the case of Egypt, under the Brotherhood, as you can see in the slide. And the most alarming development in the history of this private media in Egypt that was very instrumental in pushing the boundary of what is allowed to be said in media platform in Egypt and bringing diversity, although under certain limit under the Mubarak regime. Unfortunately, as we see with the example of Albert Shafi, the director of On TV, private TV, who is telling me, can we logically give platform to terrorism, and meaning the Muslim Brotherhood here? They moved from being the spearhead of pushing for a diversity in national media to be the spearhead of propaganda for the military regime post the military coup in Egypt under the ban of protecting national interests and combating terrorism. Another example from also how the national media are again hostage to politics. Another example from Egypt, the excessive use of media platform in political and ideological battles drove to a sad result that media lost most important gains from the uprising and the political change, and which is diversity. This is linked to the complex and tense political transition, but also the political alignment of media and journalists themselves as a perception of their role as political activists, first in the service of agenda, and lately to the service of the so-called security interests and national interests, to the extent of imposing blackout on information. And I like very much this example from Al-Masr al-Yawm. Al-Masr al-Yawm, as maybe some of you know, was really a main platform for diversity of views under the Mubarak regimes. It's played a tremendous role in changing how journalists work and in reporting from street and bringing limited representation of dissent. And now an editor, Muhammad Radwan, is telling me that we publish few of accounts from civilian deaths in Sinai under the operation of the military because we have a stand, we are with the military, and we think that the publication of such statements against the army will hinder our ethical, what he called ethical position of supporting the army in its fights against the so-called terrorists. Finally, I would like to say something on talk shows. Again, talk shows in Egypt played an instrumental role in disseminating information and educating masses. Their role after the revolution was amplified. They became the advocate of public opinion and politician. And for them, as Mahmoud Saad, a famous presenter and talk show host in Egypt, is telling me impartiality is a denial of his vocation. And for him, being impartial, being neutral, not to express an opinion is a problem. Because as far as he perceives his role, he's a columnist. He's someone who writes a column, he expresses an opinion, and then he brings his opinion to the TV and transforms it into a talk show. So for him, expressing an opinion, taking a side, is a moral and professional duty. And another example, I asked the same question to Tamer Amin, who used to be a well-known talk show host under the Mubarak regime, and after the revolution he suddenly shifted to be a pro-revolutionary talk show host, and now suddenly after the military coup he shifted in one day to become a pro-military talk show host, and he has a very simple and direct answer. There is a difference between the public opinion in the West and in the Arab countries. Here they need to be told what to think, and for him, most of the time, his audience, people will call him and tell him, please express please tell us how to think about this complex event unfolding in our life, because we need our directive to understand what's going on around us. In a country like Egypt, where illiteracy is very high, they played, talk shows played a major role in informing, but also in directing people on how to perceive their words, their political words, and the political change around them. And the organic alliance between the large majority of these talk show hosts are making them part of the regime instead of being watchdog of policies of the regime. Finally, I want to end my talk with a thought from my meetings in Tripoli in Libya with one of the former editors from the Qaddafi media, who turned now to working in private media. He's publishing his own media organization, newspaper, and he was very pessimistic about a possible future of national media. He told me to be able to talk about independent media, you need democracy, you need democratic institutions, you need rule of law, you need an environment for journalists to be able to work, which is very true, especially if we want to look to the conditions of work of journalists in Libya today. But with the raging counter-revolutions today in the Arab world, an important question is, whether we can witness any real democratic transition in the Arab world without independent and professional media. With media today, in some platform in Egypt, but also in other, in Libya and in Tunisia, with direct call for exclusion of political opponents, and in some cases direct call to kill them, we wonder whether we can talk about any democratic real change without an efficient role of media in supporting democratic change and in raising the question of professional media, the need of professional revolution inside newsrooms, separating the two topics of politics and media and talking about what are our standards as journalists, what are our values, and how we can protect this media sector from not being hostage and hijacked by politics and political agenda and again by the regime. Thank you.